1941, the world was at war and we were prepared to fight with everything we had. Back home came the Achilles, and if she never fought again, we'd remember her part in the Battle of the River Plate. She'd been in the first major naval engagement of the war, and she was still doing very well. In the early months of 1940, troops were leaving New Zealand for the second time in less than 30 years. It wasn't much of a way to usher in the new decade and welcome the completion of our first century. But they went gaily enough, these new soldiers of the first echelon, and film unit cameramen went with them. The war they were going to fight was a long way away in the Middle East and Europe. Women with their brave farewells were saying goodbye to the first of the 150,000 men who were to go overseas in the next 5 years. These were the early days when the conflict was still called the phony war. It didn't seem so phony when you just seen a fellow for maybe the last time, and it certainly wasn't phony to the men of the 1st Division when they began training in the desert. It was hot and dry and dirty, and so were the towns where they spent their leave. At home, the women went to work, and in the Second World War they did a good deal more than knit balaclavas and roll bandages. In December 1941, the New Zealand countryside was still tranquil, but the war was dangerously close. Japan was in it now, moving down the Pacific. With a great deal of determination and a great lack of weapons, the Home Guard prepared to defend the country. It seems a long time ago now, the Jap scare of 1942, but back then the training and the practicing, the air raid warnings could easily have become the real thing. We weren't going to repel borders all by ourselves. In their thousands, American servicemen came to New Zealand to begin the long advance up the Pacific. From Crete, our soldiers went back to Egypt. Many Kiwis were behind the wire. Many were dead. Those left were putting a bright face on things. 4,000 New Zealand airmen went to train in Canada and took their New Zealand customs with them. In Britain, our pilots, navigators and gunners had been fighting since the outbreak of war. There were New Zealanders in the dogfights over London and New Zealanders in the air raids on Germany. In the Middle East, the New Zealand division under General Freyberg became part of Field Marshal Montgomery's 8th Army. It was October the 23rd, 1942, and this was Alamein. Alamein was the turning point. The German Africa Corps was retreating and the 8th Army was in pursuit. A British general called our division the most formidable fighting machine in the desert. Well, we'd been there a long time. After Tripoli, one last battle and the Africa Corps was finished. So was the Middle East campaign. One German division insisted on surrendering to no one but the Kiwis, and we were pleased to have them. Italy came next. The Allies moved north into winter, the cold and bloody winter of 1943-44. And then sunshine and the welcome of liberated people glad to see an end to the slaughter. The war in Europe would soon be finished. There remained the Pacific. The National Film Unit covered the island-hopping war of the ground troops. The Americans moved up from Guadalcanal. Advance was slow, but the Allied air forces were clearing the way. The RNZAF flew mission after mission over enemy-occupied territory. Our soldiers slogged on from island to island, beachhead to beachhead. To the north, the American Air Force was hammering the mainland of Japan. In August 1945, the terrible bombs were dropped and the Second World War was over. So he toddled off into the future, falling but unbound. There was much to do. Rehabilitation schemes were begun and ex-soldiers became tradesmen. Factories which had made munitions for 5 years began turning out pots and pans. New schools were needed and new houses. New farmers were needed most of all. Learning about wool was one thing, learning about cattle was another. Men went on the land and were taught farming. They had to learn quickly. The population was growing at home, and overseas the need for food was still tremendous. New land was opened up. Over the scrub country moved the crushers, smashing down useless growth. We discovered a way of making fertile the wastelands of the North Island Central Plateau. As the early settlers had done, we burned the bush. But this time it was controlled burning, planned beforehand. After the fires came machines, disking, ploughing, clearing hundreds of thousands of acres. Then came the fertilizer, and mixed with it minerals which this soil lacked. Where there'd been useless land, there would now be good farms. Where no towns had been, towns were built, and roads went out from them. By the mid-1950s, the Central Plateau had changed beyond recognition. Something else was improving farming all over the country, aerial top dressing. Its first exponents were young men flying reconditioned tiger moths, often in the most alarming manner. Aerial farming became an industry in itself. An aircraft was specially built to drop not only fertilizer, but such things as fence lines and prefabricated buildings. At home, we were doing fine. But the rumblings of war had again taken our troops overseas. The time 1950, the place Korea, a country we'd barely heard of. This time the threat was not fascism, but communism. The Korean War provided no decisive victories. It was the flaring up of a conflict which continues today and taught the world just one thing. In war, there are only losers. A truce was declared, and we helped keep watch on the new border between North and South Korea. But the real battle has yet to be fought. New Zealand was prospering. Light industry provided household goods of every kind, and the old slogan, "Well-made New Zealand," could be taken at its face value. There were new factories using new methods to make new products. Immigration was providing new labor. By 1960, 300,000 new settlers had come in from Britain and Europe. Timber mills, paper mills, machinery shops, assembly plants. More people, more work, the need for more power. Up went the hydroelectric stations, damming the Waikato, the Clutha, the Waitaki. Power from geothermal bores was fed into the North Island grid. It's taken many years, but at last the supply of electricity has caught up with the demand. New stations are being built, anticipating the demands of the future. National Film Unit cameramen have covered so many events in the last 21 years. Now some of the things that made news. Lord Montgomery was here back in 1947. The desert campaigns were still fresh in our memories, and we gave him a great welcome. We said goodbye to the Palmyra, last of the big sailing ships to operate commercially. We'll never see her like again. The faithful old Wanganella ran aground on Barrett's Reef, a freak accident that fortunately caused no loss of life and no permanent damage to the Trans-Tasman vessel. She was safely refloated. With horror, the people of Christchurch saw Ballantyne's fire. The public gave firemen all possible help, but the blaze could not be checked. Many people died in the flames. Not all the news was of disasters. Early in 1954, there came a great day for the Wairarapa as workmen prepared to fire the last blast in the Rimutaka tunnel. 18 months later, the first train ran through. The Royal Tour put New Zealand in holiday mood for 8 weeks. When the Queen and Prince Philip left the country, we hoped very much they'd return before long. Now, nearly 9 years later, they'll soon be with us again. The Queen Mother was another royal visitor, one of the most charming we could ever hope to meet. In 1957, an expedition led by Everest conqueror Sir Edmund Hillary pushed across Antarctica. In their trundling vehicles, they reached the South Pole. 5 New Zealanders who made headlines round the world. One of these 5 men was a National Film Unit cameraman. 1959, and we played host to a party of great sportsmen, the British Isles rugby team. New Zealand won the first 3 tests, but at Eden Park, the Lions showed us a display of speed and tactics that was rugby at its best. The 4th test was their game all the way. Second half, Bev Risman couldn't be stopped as he made for the All Blacks goal line. The full-time score of 9 points to 6 gave the visitors a popular win. Ever since the Empire Games at Auckland in 1950, we've taken a great interest in athletics. 1961 saw Peter Snell put up a new world record for the mile, and at Lancaster Park in Christchurch he made a bid for the half mile. At the end of the first lap, Snell moved out into the lead. At the finish, he virtually had the track to himself and created yet another world record. Peter Snell's standing in international sport is perhaps a symbol of New Zealand's international standing in this year of 1962. Over the last few years, thousands of people of foreign birth have become naturalized New Zealanders, making our country more cosmopolitan than ever. Working in the Colombo Plan, we've been drawn closer to the neighboring countries of Southeast Asia. We discussed their problems round the conference table, and we're doing our fair share in helping to solve those problems. In every way, the future of the South Pacific seems to be part of the future of Southeast Asia. a million more people now than we had in 1941, though New Zealand is still a small nation. No one can say in what kind of world our new generations will live. We wish them well as the National Film Unit ends this brief pictorial survey of the last 21 years.